I'm Jane Kamensky, your classmate, and since January of 2024, the president and CEO here at Monticello. I'm going to ask each of my... Save the applause for my colleagues who are truly amazing and what makes this place work. I'll ask you each to introduce yourself, and then I'll do a little bit of framing of our sort of talk back here.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Steve Light. I am the Vice President for Education and Guest Experiences here at Monticello, which includes the guides and our interpretation, as well as our guest experience staff, so the people that you interacted with on your shuttles and here in the courtyard and getting you ready for your tour today. And I've been here at Monticello for just a little bit over 11 years.
And hey everyone, I'm Brandon Dillard. I'm the Director of Historic Interpretation and Audience Engagement here at Monticello, which means that I help us think about how we are going to deliver the stories that we deliver. I think a lot about audience. And I started here 15 years ago as a part-time tour guide. So I just fell in love with it and never left.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Davenport. I'm Vice President for Research and the Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson.
You need mic higher.
A little higher. I'm Andrew Davenport. I'm a historian of slavery and African American history, and I've got a green light, but okay, I just do actually need to hold it closer. Yeah, okay, thanks. I'm a historian of slavery and African American history. I've been here for almost 4 years. I just completed my doctorate at Georgetown a couple of months ago, actually. Oh, there we go.
Yeah. So we thought, you've done the sort of front of house experience going through the house. You've eaten in the cafe, seen Bill Barker. We thought we would break the fourth wall a bit and talk about how we build this experience and get questions from you that that you can only get in a kind of behind the scenes way. It's been the honor of my life to come out of the college classroom and work with interpreters and educators who are really interested in how the cutting edge of scholarship informs a public experience. If you were at the Yale Club thing I did in November or have watched the video, which Brian relentlessly pushed out to the group, you'll have heard me say that I came here because I thought Monticello was a lever to build civic capacity, both through sharing content that is our shared patrimony as people of the United States to reckon with and to continue that work of making a more perfect union. And because, in addition to sharing content, we're in a position to teach the skills and dispositions necessary to self-government in subtle ways, right? Like modeling ways to answer questions from people who disagree with you. We serve a population that represents the entirety of the American political spectrum in unsorted groups, right? So we're an intentional group. We came through the House almost entirely together from a position of shared education that built trust. For most of our groups, they have no control over who they're in the House with, which is a great can be a great challenge for our guides, and my colleagues can talk about some of the kinds of questions, the kinds of resistance that feature on Monticello tours regularly. But it's also a great opportunity, right? We had last year just shy of 304,000 visitors. When I talk to individual and foundation philanthropists who support this work, I talk about how quickly that scales, right? So 304,000 visitors with an absurdly high net promoter score, right? Almost 9 out of 10 say they would recommend the experience to their friends. So if they do recommend it to 10 friends, that's 3 million people. If they recommend it to 10 friends, that's 30 million people. We engage online as well as on site. So in a time when constitutional democracy needs a little love and commitment, shared commitment to the sacred work of self-government, and I'm as we go into the 250th anniversary of the Declaration, increasingly and self-consciously using the language of virtue, values, and the sacred, because I think it takes that renewing the covenant kind of commitment to carry this work forward. We feel to me like a lever that that can really move a larger cog, or at least that was my bid coming out of the Harvard classroom. Just to tell you a little bit about the structure of the operation, we are a private 501c3, have been private since 1923. We have no ongoing federal, state, or municipal funding. Our budget is about $40 million a year. We employ 400 people, some of them part-time, and about another 100 volunteers. Of that $40 million budget, ticket revenue covers about 25%. So just as when you pay the Earth to send your kid to college and you're told that it's not covering the whole cost of educating the student, we have a diverse budget that depends also on retail. So glad to see many of you with bags from the shop. Retail is about another 25%. Endowment availing or endowment draw is about another 25%, and annual philanthropy is about another 25%. And I spend a lot of my time as the sort of front-facing ambassador for the place, articulating our value proposition and raising friends and supporters. I believe in it enough myself that it is my top philanthropic commitment as an individual. So I see us at a point of lift as a civil society organization, and sort of articulating that transformation of historic house museum to historic house museum that serves American constitutional democracy in vital ways is the sort of through line of my vision, and the strategic planning work that we're in. So that's what I came here to do. I found a group of colleagues, and Steve and Andrew are part of the leadership team with me. Brandon, a vital member of our senior staff. It's amazing to be with colleagues who see themselves in the work of solving problems. I'll say one more thing about the difference between here and higher ed before turning it over to Steve. We learn really quickly whether something's working or not, right? It's retail. So if someone's not buying the product, it doesn't matter how good it is, it's the wrong product. So we think a lot about how we gather data from our patrons, our guests, how we learn to give them what we know is true and urgent in a way that they can accept it and want it. It's an organization that's capable of being dynamic and nimble, which is for those of you who are in the academy, somewhat unlike higher ed. And with that, I guess I'll say one more thing, which is I see this as, in my career, as an interval of public service, right? What can a historian do in public service? And to me, that was the call.
All right. So as I said in my introduction, I've been at Monticello for over 11 years. My career and background is in history and history museum studies. And what I want to talk to you all about today is you've all gone through the experience now, and I want to kind of give you a little bit of behind the scenes about how we prepare, particularly our guides in the Education and Visitor Programs Department, for that experience. I'm a pretty biased person, but I think we have some of the best historical interpreters doing this job in our industry. And I think it's really important. Jane kind of set up our annual visitation and the types of people who are coming here. So I kind of want to focus on the challenge and opportunity we have, and then talk about how we go about that. So over 300,000 people a year, that translates into, when most of them are taking tours, if we're just talking about going through the first floor of that house on the top of the mountain alone, about 15,000 tours a year. You were all here on a pretty busy morning. But on our peak days in April and July and October, we can have days with more than 2,000 visitors. That translates into 90 to 100 tours a day of that house. And I think you all saw this morning. That means that sometimes we have groups starting 5 minutes apart. Now you take to that people coming from a broad spectrum of political viewpoints, broad spectrum of experiences, and also a broad knowledge base of their prior knowledge of the story of Thomas Jefferson, the story of Monticello before they get here. And you can begin to see some of the challenges of asking a historical guide here to spend about 45 minutes and cover what is an incredibly complicated, nuanced, layered history of this place, an incredibly complicated, nuanced, layered history of Thomas Jefferson and his role in the founding of this country. And so that's a really big task. And we're really proud about how we go about preparing the guides to do that. Some people are surprised when I tell them we do not ask our guides to memorize a script. There is no, like, this is a standard script, this is what you're gonna say on your tour. And we believe that because historical interpretation is not about just memorizing facts, just as history in the classroom is not about memorizing facts and dates, although a lot of people think that it is. Historical interpretation is about making connections with your audience. And so it is knowing the content, but also knowing your audience and finding out what's gonna spark curiosity for those visitors and what's gonna make that lasting connection. And I think the opportunity our historical interpreters have is the same opportunity that a teacher in a high school or middle school history class has. People aren't just naturally interested in history. I've loved history my whole life, and I can tell you all the names of my history teachers through 7th grade, 8th grade, through high school, because they spark that curiosity in me. And people coming here to Monticello, our guides have that same opportunity. So when we hire a guide at Monticello, each guide receives 100 hours of training over the course of a month to a month and a half before they ever lead a tour. And that training is multifaceted. And Jane likes to say, and this is completely true, that those guides receive more on-the-job training than sometimes history teachers in the classroom and in middle school are. And we have a tremendous resource here at Monticello called the International Center for Jefferson Studies. Andrew's going to talk about that. So some of that training is content-based. So they're going to be meeting with historians to learn about Jefferson's political career. They're going to be meeting with our archaeology team and the editors at the Papers for Thomas Jefferson. They're going to be meeting with the people who run our Getting Word African American Oral History Project and learning the content and the stories of the site. But then they're also going to be meeting with the folks on our Education and Visitor Programs team for what we call technique-based training. And technique-based training is about how to make connections with that content. So some of that training is how do you adapt your tour for a school group? How do you adapt your tour to a family audience with young children? How do you approach interpreting difficult history? And that is all part of the training as well. Because our guides, when they go out for a tour, they might have a group of 25 Yale alumni from the class of 1985. They might have, a completely random group of strangers who come from all over the United States, sometimes people from countries around the world. They might have, and we see this a lot in the spring, you probably see some of them today, 8th graders from California on their DC field trip who are tired because they're driving all over the place in Washington, DC. They might have 4th graders from the city of Richmond. We have a partnership program with the city of Richmond where every 4th grader in that school district through donor philanthropy comes to Monticello for free each year. And 2/3 of the students that come through Monticello each year come from disadvantaged economic conditions. So it's a wide range of visitors that we're preparing our guides for. So they go through that 100 hours of training before they lead their first tour. They write their own script, although we also tell them that the process of writing the script is to put down on paper what they want to say, but every tour that they give is going to be a little bit different because they're going to be giving it to people who are different each time, and they're going to be having those skills to make those connections. They'll work with their manager to review the tour. We also have a mentor process where each guide is paired with a veteran guide, and their first few days of giving tours will be with a mentor. And we also have a kind of a culture of continuous improvement. So once you have got that check next to your name, you've led your first tour, you're good to go. That doesn't mean your learning stops. We have 12 hours of required training each year for continuing education, and we have a whole menu of training that includes lectures, again, more technique training sessions, as well as opportunities like field trips and things like that, so that our interpreters have that ability to spark that curiosity and really change people's lives. And we always tell them, you're not going to see the change right away, but our goal is, if they can buy a book in the shop because they were interested in something, or they leave in the car on the way home and they're having a conversation with their family members, that's where the work we do can change people.
I'm reacting to something you said, Steve, which is that you could name all of your history teachers. I don't think I can do that. And I shudder to think that they probably do remember me. I'm a first-generation college student, and I was raised by a single mom and my grandparents. My grandfather was a sharecropper with a grade school education, right? So I went to college in Georgia on something called the Hope Scholarship, which means that I went for free to any state school, given that I maintained a B in high school, which somehow I managed to do. That means that after college, which was 2 years before the Great Recession hit, I had a degree in philosophy because that seemed like a good idea. And none of the big philosophy firms in Atlanta ever gave me a job. So I was a bartender for a really long time. And I was tending bar and in Atlanta looking for something else. My sister took a job in Charlottesville. She was working for a tech startup. And I came to visit my sister. I was tending bar in this college town. I was in my 20s, and I read an ad in a newspaper to come be a part-time tour guide at Monticello. And I thought that would be a fun way to spend my days. I answered the ad and surprisingly was hired. And I quickly fell in love, not only with the work, but with the team of people who were so committed to this. And I'm going to tell a story that I hope translates, that shows something that is a strength here that Steve just hinted at. When I was in my early 20s and working here, late 20s, I was dating a woman, and it was going well, and so she took me home to meet the family. And I'd been working here for a while, and I'd made a lot of friends here, and, work buddies. And I met her grandfather, who was a proud veteran, and he was telling me about his time when he was stationed in the Philippines. And he said, I was stationed in Mindanao. And I said to this man, oh, one of my work buddies was stationed there in like 54. When were you there? And that man looked at me like I was having him on, right? Like I was messing with him a little bit, because he's like, why would this kid have a buddy who was stationed in the Philippines at the same time I was? Because I was in my 20s and that man was in his 80s. But I felt so close to him that he really was my buddy, right? His name was Ed. He was a tour guide here for a long time, and he was a brilliant tour guide. Ed's passed on now. Mr. Dishinger's passed on now. Right, but there's something really powerful about the group of people up here who represent from 18 to 85, people who do this not because they're getting rich and famous, not because it's easy, and sometimes not because it's all that fun, but because they care about it, because they genuinely believe that this is something that can change the way that people understand the world they live in. And Steve mentioned there's no scripts. That's true. The strength of each guide comes out in their voice, and that's something that I think you probably saw today. And when you come back, you will see that again, because you will never take the same tour here at Monticello. And that could be even if you have the same guide, right? The tour that they will give you the next time will be different because they're reacting to you. My family, not super educated, but Southern Appalachia, long line of storytellers. And so I think that I have a love for that, and I see what we do here, it is telling stories. But it's really firmly rooted in strong research and scholarship of history that shows us that stories that are complex, stories that invite us to critically analyze the past, that invite us to celebrate those aspects of our founding that are laudable, those stories make us whole. They make us understand not only where we come from, but also where we might go. And every person who works here dedicates themselves to that. And it's something that I just never thought would happen in my life, and I fell right in love with it. And I think that this group of people, they deserve all of the applause that we give them. And I think that they are changing the world. And I think if there is any hope for saving this thing called democracy, it depends on all of us. And it might be a little grandiose, but I think places like this serve a really valid function.
I've got to follow you guys. Like Brandon, I was also raised by a single mom and my grandma in Norwalk, Connecticut. And when I was in college, I became really interested in American history and family history more generally. My grandmother's from Richmond, just down the road here, and all four of her grandparents were born into slavery in this area. And two of her grandparents were born into slavery just down the street here in Albemarle County. And those folks, I have their images, their photographs, and what I decided to do after leaving college was to try and connect with as many people on both sides of my family. My dad's family is Irish, and on my grandmother's side of the family, and meet descendants of the enslavers and the enslaved, and as many distant cousins as I possibly could. And that was a real journey. I was a personal assistant to Louis Lapham, the writer and editor who's class of 1957 from Yale, and he encouraged me to go to the classroom, which was also my grandmother's advice, but I didn't take it from her, I took it from Louis. And I taught middle school for a couple of years in Brooklyn, and then I taught high school in Connecticut, and I can confirm what Steve said, that our guides here have more training than classroom teachers do. I know that too well. And I taught at the second best private college in Connecticut at Fairfield University before going to do my doctorate at Georgetown. But about a decade or so ago, in doing my own family history and the history of a bunch of other people, I was connected with Monticello because my grandmother's part of her family descends from the extended Hemmings family here. And in making connections with researchers and historians here, I decided that I wanted to learn as much as I possibly could about life at Monticello, about Jefferson himself, about the enslaved community, and this really neat project that the International Center for Jefferson Studies hosts called the Getting Word Project. I led that project for the last 3.5 years or so. I've been in my new role for the past couple of months. And this is an ongoing research and oral history initiative. We've done upwards of 400 interviews with people since 1993. The vast majority of our participants are lineal descendants of folks who were enslaved here. And because Monticello is the best documented plantation in the Americas, we have not just 2 million archaeological artifacts from this 5,000 acre site, 3,000 of those acres we now steward. We don't just have 65,000 documents in Jefferson's archive, but we also have this core of knowledge that has grown from the Getting Word Project in these oral histories across time. So at this place and in all of the places that folks from the mountaintop have gone across the United States and in fact across the world, we can tell a very complete American and global story of what it has meant to be from here from the last couple of centuries. And I think that that is one of the greater benefits of being here. My first introduction here was in 2016, and it was for a reunion of Getting Word participants, which happens every now and then. Our most recent reunion, we had about 300 descendants of the enslaved community return. And in this particular event, it was a sleepover. And it's my first time there, as I mentioned, and about 30 or so descendants joined at the mountaintop on Mulberry Row, and we slept overnight. And we're the only people here. That was my very first time here. Yours might have been on tour. Mine was around a fire on Mulberry Row with people from the Gillettes, Grangers, Evans, Hemmings, Hughes, Colbert's families. And I was stunned, having been in the classroom and tried to inspire my students the best that I could, that of what was happening with that group of people around this fire, and that you could do that type of historical work and research as repair at Monticello, and that people would want to return here, which moved me to my core and further encouraged me to become a historian. So our research department serves up material to our world-class interpreters. And the research division is comprised of our archaeology department, which is among the longest continuous archaeological excavations in the continent. We've been at it since about the 1950s or so, and as I mentioned, we've unearthed almost 2 million artifacts, which we keep in storage here. Each of those artifacts tell a story. And then, of course, there's the documentary record, and we have a documentary editing team here, the Papers of Thomas Jefferson Retirement Series, which is a sister institution of the Princeton Papers Project, the Papers of Thomas Jefferson, which has been around since the mid-1940s. And we're still publishing documents from Jefferson's archive. We do it every single year, and on deadline, every year too, I might add. So just in the past 25 years or so, we've published 12,000 documents, Jefferson's correspondence coming in and outgoing correspondence as well. And then there's the Getting Word African American Oral History Project, which is our research and oral history initiative. And if there's about 65,000 documents in Jefferson's archive, give or take, and we unearth new ones every day almost, there's just 4 firsthand perspectives from people who were born into slavery at Monticello. And this archival imbalance motivates me as a historian and the historians who preceded me and who will succeed me in an effort to try and learn more, to expand the archive. And in reaching out to descendant families in particular, we're not just archiving their family stories, but we're also learning about what life around Monticello was like. And I'll give you an example. Did anyone hear the story of Peter Fawcett while you were on tour here? He was 11 years old when he was sold from here in 1827. He's in slavery for the next 25 years or so. And we know that he attempts to escape slavery in Virginia a couple of times. He writes a free pass for his sister, who successfully escapes. And he will eventually be purchased out of slavery and will relocate to Cincinnati, where much of his family is. He'll become a regionally famous Baptist minister in Cincinnati. He is known as the godfather of the Black Baptist Church in Ohio. He's a civil rights activist and a Civil War veteran himself. The Getting Word Project has been looking for Fawcett descendants since its inception in 1993. And just 2 summers ago, I got a phone call in my office from a public historian in Cincinnati, and she said, I met this gentleman, he's in his mid-80s, and I believe him to be a Peter Fawcett descendant. And I said, keep going. She said, and he comes into this local jazz club called Cafe Vivace in Walnut Hills in Cincinnati, and he brings with him his ancestors' free papers. And also a letter. The free papers are from 1850, and the letter is from 1858, and it's addressed to Joseph Fawcett, who was a blacksmith here and Peter Fawcett's father. And I said, I'll see you shortly, and I booked a flight, and I went out to Cincinnati, and I went to meet Mr. Clark, who's about 84, 85 years old. And indeed, he had his ancestor, Peter Fawcett's free papers, the original copy, that had been folded up and probably kept in Fawcett's, in his coat. And his family had kept those documents for 175 years. And that letter is the only extant letter between formerly enslaved people from Monticello known to exist. And so that's what happens when you're looking for answers, when you make it known that you're on the other line of the phone. And we have countless examples of stories like that are helping us piece together this puzzle, not just of what happened here at Monticello or what Jefferson's life like, what the enslaved community's life was like, but also what happened after Monticello too.
So I'll take these guys over any history department anywhere, honestly. And what we want to do is open the floor and be a resource to you, hear your questions, thoughts. I mentioned both this morning and now that we're in strategic planning, so we're really thinking about the sustainability of the enterprise in the years ahead, how we grow our impact, how we stay a healthy organization that can afford to do the kind of training and painstaking work that Steve and Andrew and Brandon have described. And I saw a hand in the second row.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much. That was super helpful. And I have to admit, I thought that our tour guide was reading from a script because it was so perfectly balanced. And I'm curious how this institution evolves what these folks are trained to say.
Yes.
Because as the society in which we live continues to evolve, of course, and the topics that these tours seem to address are very politically sensitive. And so just I'm curious what process you guys use that leads to final call about how exactly things are discussed.
It's a great question. I'll give a top line answer, and then I'm going to turn it over to Brandon, who does a lot of this work. And you are not incorrect that I would say the last few years, but really the last couple of decades, right? We have the culture wars, we have the history wars, right? The debate over whose story to tell it, how to emphasize what portions. And this is probably one of the most difficult sites in America to tell those stories. And we do put a lot of thought into how we do that. And I will also say one of the things that I'm proud about is that we involve our guides in that process. And so one of the ways we talked about continuing education training, we hold regular roundtables, which is a space for the management team in education and visitor programs, and Brandon as our director of historic interpretation, to listen to what our guides are bringing back from their tours and the reactions that they're getting. And you're right, language and how you talk about things changes and evolves over time. And so we workshop and work with the guides through those sessions on how to balance their tour, where, it's even things as strategic as where to place certain content within your tour. History museums in general are among the most trusted institutions we still have. The surveys show year after year that as trust is falling in higher education, trust is falling in what your teacher in your high school classroom, trust is falling across the board. Museums are still maintaining a high level of trustworthiness. And so part of what we talk about with our guides is how to build that trust with your group at the beginning. So what does your introduction look like? How are you affirming some of the prior knowledge that your guests have, and waiting until you've built trust with your group before you start challenging, presenting information that might challenge their point of view. And it's not a foolproof, system. But it is the leadership of both our education and visitor programs department, as well as Brandon as our director of historic interpretation, that kind of make the final say on how we're training guides, but it is a collaborative process.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that it's always changing, right? It's an iterative process that itself is a bit of a dance between audiences and interpreters. And 100 years is a long time. So I've spent a lot of time in the archives here looking at old tour scripts from back in the day, and it's a fascinating thing. One of the things that is often said about Monticello is that we didn't talk about slavery for a long time, and I'm going to paraphrase one of our colleagues, Emily Greenfield, who's a scholar at Stanford, right? And she says, no, we've always talked about slavery. It just changes how we've talked about slavery over time. And I think that's really important when looking at the tour guides at Monticello in the 1920s and 30s, who were all African-American men who worked for gratuities. And so if you start digging through the archive to try and find exactly the tours that they were giving, you cannot find them. But you can find some outlines of some of the content points. And thinking about how they were talking about slavery in the 1920s and 30s to a largely white audience, right? To a white audience. What did that look like? And what was that conversation like? Man, I wish I knew, right? But I also know they work for tips, which means that there is a bit of, there's a financial transaction that's involved in how you are pleasing people, right? It's fascinating. And to think about how that changes throughout the mid-20th century when the National Park Service really professionalizes the whole arc of historic interpretation here, we followed suit. And that the trends of both the field, the academy, as well as larger public discourse definitely has an impact on how we talk about things. It doesn't change the content, it just changes the way we deliver the content. And the words that we use are very carefully deliberated constantly, and they change. And I know for a fact that some of the things that we say right now, in 20 years, we will look back at and say, whew, can't believe we said it that way. And I'll look at papers I wrote 15 years ago for the people who work here and say, oof, wouldn't say it that way. And so what I think is really important for our team, and something that I tell them often, is be kind to yourself and have the humility to be okay with change. And to recognize that as the discourse changes, the way that we'll look back to even how we talked about it a few years prior should also change. And that's a good thing, because if we're striving towards better, then we should constantly be thinking about that.
So I'll just add a couple of things. So Brandon talks often in his work as our director of historic interpretation about meeting people where they are. I think the sense of an audience is really important to the work and is really different from my life as a scholar and Research One instructor before, right? It doesn't matter if what you're saying is absolutely correct if no one can hear it. It doesn't matter if it is the latest academic language, but half the people who have walked in the door immediately shut off when they hear a phrase like structural racism, right? Like, you can communicate the legacies of slavery on the structure of our society through the names of individuals and the stories of their lives. So it's very much a calling in rather than a calling out of a pluralist audience, and I think that's modeling the work of deliberation, of curiosity, of civic friendship. We're leaning into this tour that's going to be centered on Jefferson and Adams. It's subtle and it's sensitive to where and who that audience is. I would say we never pull punches, but we also don't punch people because that's not good guest relations. I'll say, or so I'm told. I think there is throughout the staff and in those people who Brandon described in ways that that brought me to tears, and I do come to tears here all the time. There's an ethos of both and. Right, so if you want to work at Monticello because you think Jefferson was the greatest marble icon that ever lived, you will be miserable here. And if you want to work at Monticello because you think Jefferson was Hitler and you get to tear him down every day, you will be miserable here, right? It's teaching people that two things can be true at the same time, right? The author of the most aspirational sentence, of the most aspirational document in the history of Western democracy, was not only an enslaver and the father of children with an enslaved woman who was not even remotely of age when they began to have a relationship, but also knew slavery was wrong. It's all of those ands, and I think if we can get the language right in a way that teaches people to practice a both and mentality instead of a no but or a zero sum mentality, it's good for democracy. I saw Tina, Dan, go. You.
Okay. First, I've got a bunch of things to say, so I'm sorry, but I feel...
Is there a question?
Yes, there is. There is a question. All right, there's a question. But I just want to say this is a super stimulating day. Walking through the woods to get here, the tour, the contemplative area, everything has been really stimulating, and you've done a great job with this. So thanks for that. And Dina and I came here maybe 20, 25 years ago. I think the way that slavery was presented then and now on the tour has changed quite a bit. I feel like it was kind of compartmentalized then, and it's put in everything now, and I think that's a big improvement. So I think that's great. I had a couple of thoughts, and I'm taking, Jane, your point of view that you're looking for feedback. I love you saying, you don't want to make this a historical house museum, because it's really not that.
It's not only that.
It's not only that. And I want, first thought is, how do you make this more broadly appealing? How do you make it not just a historical house museum? And I'm also looking at, our friends, our classmates who are here. It's not a typical cross-section of our class. This is a wider group than our class. And so how do you broaden the appeal? And so I'm wondering what you're thinking about doing there, because I think this place should have an appeal beyond being a historical house museum. So what do you do there? Second is, I'm wondering in the tours, and actually in what you were saying today, and Jane, what you were saying earlier, people use the present tense when they're talking about Jefferson. And obviously, everything you do is kind of intentional. But, and not just Jefferson. I mean, you said, Peter Fawcett attempts to escape slavery. Not attempted, but attempts. It's like everything is in the kind of present continuous when you're describing things that happened 200 years ago. So I'm wondering if you can talk about why you do that, because that really struck me as a way that the tour was presented, and a way that all of you talk about Jefferson as if, he's around the corner almost.
Well, he did just walk by.
Yeah, he is around the corner, right. And then one more, I'm sorry, but one more thing that I want to raise, just because this was super stimulating. I've heard many of us talking about Hamilton, and we've all, Hamilton has been a big thing, and that's kind of on our minds when we're here. But, Hamilton the musical is one view of our founding that puts Hamilton in the center, and here we have another view of our founding that puts Jefferson in the center. And I'm wondering if you can do something here that is a broader view of the founding. I mean, it's Jefferson's house, so maybe it has to be a Jefferson-centric view of the founding, but it struck me as very, we didn't hear about Alexander Hamilton here, except when everybody here was talking about the songs from the musical that they were reminded of. So those are all my questions. Thanks for.
So I'll take the founding thing very quickly, and then I want to throw to Andrew and Brandon on the present tense, which, by the way, drives me crazy. So the way that I want people to come away thinking about the founding is that we are all founders. Right, that everybody who was on the continent of North America in 1776 was a founder of the United States, whether they wanted to be or not, and that people like Jefferson were fortunate but also entirely ordinary, right? They were ordinary people who had a set of skills that were called upon to do something in an extraordinary time, and that's just like all of us every day, right? Democracy requires continual founding. So I would love to keep talking afterwards over wine about pluralizing that small f founders, right? We have a guy, there will be a t-shirt that says, "Our guy wrote it," and that is important to the business model. We build out from him as the center of a constellation of founders, but I think the small f and the pluralizing and dragging that into the present is really important. Talk about the present tense.
This will be an unsatisfactory answer, but I don't write that way. First of all, Jane.
I know.
In an effort to connect with an audience in just speaking, it's a narrative tick to speak in the present tense, but I spoke in the past tense too. So Peter Fawcett was sold at the age of 11. Mm-hmm. I do not tend to think that Jefferson is alive and well. Jefferson is long gone. So it's just a speaking tick.
I would just agree with that. I think I have a tendency to tell people not to do that as well. So, but I think that when you're just having the key thing is conversational tone, right? And so that's what we focus on, is that it shouldn't feel like a lecture, it shouldn't feel canned. And to everything Jane said, like if you're going to teach somebody, you got to reach somebody, right? And so it's about how are you sounding comfortable and how is the conversation flowing easily? And I think that means that tense gets a little muddy sometimes.
Okay, I always thought it was deliberate. And I'll make a case for it being deliberate, which we can either train on or reject. I think it is hard for those of us, even those of us who were history majors and became historians, to remember that people face history forward, right? Like our past is their present and future, and if we could just remember that, right? Like if that was the lesson you took away, that would change the world, right? That people live in predicaments, they make imperfect choices about how to resolve those predicaments. So I do think the present tense puts people into the middle of the middle. And there is an effectiveness to that. I saw a bunch more hands, and I'm talking too much. Tina, Dan, is that Eric?
Mine's short, I don't need a mic. How do you manage people who are on the tours and are from such different parts of thinking that they don't get along well?
Security.
Yeah, we just said go. We spend a lot of time training technique, and at its most extreme, we train de-escalation, right? We train our team to think about how can we present as calm and collected in a way that will invite others to do the same. Yeah.
And I will add to this, Brenda's right, we do a lot of training on that, and it very rarely gets to that point. We do a lot of training on de-escalation. Almost never do we have to deal with that. But I also think that this is an opportunity, and Jane referenced this at the beginning of her remarks. We have people from different points of view on the same tour and in a shared experience. There are not too many places right now in America where that can happen. And so we are planning to lean into that a little bit and structure ways in which they can talk to each other civilly about their disagreements. And so Jane referenced, we're launching a tour this coming spring called Founding Friends, Founding Foes. And it focuses on the relationship of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And it's our 250th tour, so the semi-quincentennial, which hopefully you all know that word by now. We've been saying it for the last 7 years or so. It's coming up in 2026. Jefferson and Adams were essential to the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, which is what we will be celebrating in 2026. But we wanted to lean into their whole scope of their story from 76 all the way to 1826, when they both died on the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And not just on that moment of creation, but on the fact that America was born of political disagreement, civil discourse, and eventually agreement on shared values. And so we will be structuring this tour around Jefferson and Adams' relationship, bringing in some of the other founders like Hamilton along the way.
If we have to. He really was not all that, let me just say.
But one of the things that we're really excited about, I'm just gonna move on from Hamilton here. Is we have a card deck that we've developed called Feast of Reason, which is a structured way to invite people to engage in dialogue about civics and history. And we've developed a special set of this card deck for this tour. And so we will have kind of an evening version of this tour where after you take the tour and learn about Jefferson and Hamilton and Adams and their disagreements and how they helped to build this country and where they failed and where they succeeded, we will provide food and drink and ask the people on that tour to sit down, and through that facilitation of the card deck, have themselves start to talk about civic friendship and shared values and have that conversation across difference. So that's something that we're really excited about for 2025 and 26.
The card deck is a series of questions. I think of it as a version of the New York Times 32 questions to ask to fall in love, except it's 32 questions to ask to fall in love with self-government and democracy. And it's an experience that we've done as a high-ticket donor dinner, and now we're doing it at retail. We got a significant gift to underwrite this tour, deepen guide training. They're training with bridging organizations in cross-partisan facilitation. And that gift of $100,000 came from a guide. Yeah. Dan, Eric, Joseph.
You talked about how you sometimes do experience resistance during the tours. I'd love to hear more about that. Is it that people don't want to hear stuff, or is it that stuff makes them angry? What makes them angry? And what happened? And do you find that there is some learning going on from those folks?
So start by reiterating something Steve said, which this does happen, but it does not happen that much, right? The majority of people who are here, we don't actually see this processing. The processing happens after they leave. But it happens enough that we can say that it happens. And what you can see is body language. That happens almost every tour, right? And actually, when I was in grad school, I took a GoPro and I filmed a bunch of tours just to watch how people would respond. And when you say the name Sally Hemings, like, people have a physical response to that. And it's fascinating to see how some people will turn away and some people will lean in, right? And if you start looking and analyzing how that falls along people's backgrounds, identities, partisan ideologies, it's a complicated conversation. At its worst, I have seen people get really emotional. What is fascinating about that is that it often manifests differently depending on the member of our staff. So if the guide is a woman in her 20s, she stands a likelier chance of being yelled at. If I'm giving a tour, I don't get yelled at, not often. Although I've been here long enough that I've seen that change in the time that I've been here. When I started and had a ponytail and looked like I was in college myself, it was different. But now people, they listen to me. And there's a lot to that tells us a little bit about what authority looks like in America and what people assume authority looks like. So what's interesting to me is that anyone would have such a deeply rooted emotional response simply because a guide said, and Thomas Jefferson enslaved people. Right? Like, at no point is a guide trying to tear someone down or trying to say something incendiary. They're just presenting the facts. But sometimes the ways that people respond to those facts, built upon whatever factor is happening in their lives, will cause resistance. And so what we try to do in those moments is teach our guides to how do you reach the point where you're having the conversation where you're talking about a person, and get them to have that empathy for the historical figure, to recognize that it's a person. It's a person who had a set of circumstances thrust upon them, and all the rest of these people are just caught up in it. And how can we have that human connection? And sometimes it works. Most of the time it works. Sometimes people go home and they write all caps, very nasty letters online.
Eric.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's one of the huge ironies and almost what Jefferson's almost uniquely interesting because he actually wrote the words, all men are created equal, and enslaved people, and didn't free them on his death.
Yeah.
So,
And knew it was wrong.
and knew it was wrong,
Yeah.
exactly. And so I'm sure at some level you're going to say this isn't knowable, but how do you guys understand that? Like, you've spent a lot of time thinking about it. Is it just, like, there's some economic argument, right? Like, what do you think was up? Like, what about that?
Andrew, can I ask you to take that?
Yeah. You know, I've done a lot of work on this, and I think, Jefferson is radically anti-slavery as a younger person. And over time, he becomes more conservative on the subject. And you can see it, there's a shift in the 1790s, which is also the time when he realizes how deep in debt he really is. And my thinking on the subject is that he is the most self-aware about, for his peer group for the most part, about how wrong morally slavery is. He is unable fiscally to get out of it and can't see a way out of it. And that's always why he says, here I go, present tense again, where he writes to his correspondents that, it's up to you, it's up to the next generation. So, financially and legally, he cannot free enslaved people upon his deathbed. He has debtors at the wazoo, and they're lined up, waiting to seize assets, seize enslaved people. So that's the historical answer. How about I leave it at that instead of speculating? I think that it's not a matter of it's just the most fascinating contradiction in American history. And his own children, 6 of them, 4 of whom lived to adulthood, are born into the institution. And he does free them. And he holds up the promise that he makes to Sally Hemings that he would free their children that he had with her. But it did not extend to other members of the enslaved community. And that's worth pointing out.
I want to test a theory on my colleagues. I think that it's complicated when people in the past disappoint us, right? Like, can you have empathy and humility without expecting to be either delighted or disappointed, right? Like, I want him to intrigue us and to intrigue us to dig deeper. I had a donor colleague who said she wanted a bumper sticker that said Jefferson was not the only hypocrite and that the surface should be a mirror, right? So I guess disappointment is an engagement point, as I know from having lived with my mother. And I wonder if it's something that that we can then mobilize as a point of connection, or whether we're trying to get past us, right? Like I hear an undercurrent of that, Eric, of like, it's just so disappointing that the guy who reached here also some ways lived here, as we all do in different ways, but our highs are probably less high and our lows are less low. So just riff on disappointment for a minute.
Yeah, if I can jump back in, because I think I've received this question and ask it of myself so frequently that I have decided to ask a different question, and that's not why didn't he free enslaved people, but how did they respond to not being freed? And that has opened up a whole world of scholarship for me, that instead of leaving the story at July 4th, 1826, or at the auctions of mid-January 1827, I can go into the archive and try and find the stories of what happened to the 130 people who were sold from here, and the 70 people who were sold from Poplar Forest. What was their familial responses? And that involves connecting with free relatives to sell real estate, to then use that capital to purchase back relatives. It involves being sold to New Orleans and somehow being freed. It also involves, it runs the gamut. So instead of just leaving it at the frustration, I've tried to flip it and say, how did African Americans feel, and how did they respond to this historical situation?
I will just add to your point, Jane, about disappointment. One of our former colleagues who trained Brandon and I always had a saying, Thomas Jefferson didn't live his life to make you feel better in the 21st century. And part of, we have people that come here that they are reading the history through their own experiences in the present. And the past is a foreign country, and it's way more complicated. And to me, the real stories and the human stories of all of the individuals of this place are way more interesting when they live in that kind of complicated gray area than they are if you're trying to prove that, Jefferson was this icon on a mountain, or if you're trying to tear this statue down.
Okay, Joseph, and then Maggie, who is a child of former Monticello leaders, wants to talk.
I just have one question. I have a couple questions for you, Jane, and this is based on watching your YouTube video, which I thought was just amazing at the Yale Club, regarding civics, a term which I had not really thought about for about more than 50 years, and about the future, and then and I was really stunned by the approach of Harvard's provost office about the semi-quincentennial, if I say that correctly. What do you perceive as the future as a professional educator your whole life about whether in sort of American pedagogy we will be able to teach civics again, and if that's something that's not so toxic that we can't teach it. Number two, if the institutions such as Harvard and Yale are not likely to touch this topic, where will it stem from, and will it be you? Because clearly the 250th anniversary is such an important thing, and perhaps out of here may be the most important place that you can teach it, because Jefferson is so much at the center of that. So,
because he wrote the thing. So I didn't have civics growing up, and I suspect most of us didn't, because it was exactly the moment where higher ed and then ed schools teaching K-12 evacuated civic content from the curriculum, sort of post-1968, thinking that it felt like teaching religion, right? And it is civil religion, right? People need things to bind them as a polity, or else they find the bonds that are the most natural and often the most destructive, right? The most tribal. So we walked away from teaching civics for 2 generations. I think that is one of the whirlwinds that we're reaping now, not just the lack of knowledge of what are the 3 branches of government and what are checks and balances, which I think would be actually useful for more people to know. But how, we're in a system where there are no passengers, only drivers. How do you drive the freaking car? And that's one of the things that civics teaches in terms of skills and dispositions, right? Building coalitions, making necessary and sometimes regrettable compromises to move an issue forward. I think higher ed is increasingly interested in the teaching of the skills of democracy. There is a broad higher ed network that is equivalent to the K-12 and Community Learning Partners network that I've been part of with Educating for American Democracy. I think if you talk to 8th graders, you will have a much better sign of civic health than if you talk to most adults. So if we can just get those kids older, we'll be in a better place. I think it's an unfortunate arena where higher ed is following rather than leading, and you could multiply those, right? Higher ed is following. Just that's part of the crisis of trust in higher ed. But I do think that civil society institutions, K-12, NGO partners are just, it's a Sputnik moment for civic ed, right? Where you've seen the cost of the disinvestment. The challenge is, and I face this a lot when I'm talking to funders, the ROI is real, but it's very slow. Right, there's no, there are groups developing trust barometers so that we can see small shifts in trust and in the diminishing of perception gaps, but it's not like I turned out this many more voters in my county. It's not that kind of fast fix. I hope that we realize right now that there are no fast fixes. There's only the patient, slow, endless reinventing work of founding. So thank you for that question. And Kat, and then Maggie, because buses are waiting to take us to wine.
I echo all the gratitude and the incredibly transformative experience. But coming here and experiencing it in real life, it's phenomenal. And how are you extending this out to people who can't see here? maybe talk about the K-12 Coalition or other ways you're helping do that. So.
This question, and I need a better way of describing this than the one I have because it sounds like a stalker, but this question of how to follow people home, right? Or how to reach them where they are through digital content, we're now working on a project called Declaration Book Clubs. Steve, do you want to say a moment about Declaration Book Clubs?
Yeah, so for 2026, we're working on creating a resource that book clubs across the nation can take and meet on their own, go have a meal someplace, have drinks, and actually engage with content around the Declaration. So it's organized around kind of 3 separate meetings, one focused on the actual drafting of the Declaration in 76, the second being that moment in 1826 when Jefferson and Adams pass away on the 50th anniversary, but also is really the first significant moment of commemoration and veneration of the Declaration. And then the last one being on the legacies of the Declaration. And so it's organized around a set of readings, some videos, as well as structured kind of questions. So people can pick it up, maybe buy some Jefferson Vineyards wine, and meet with their friends and have a conversation about the Declaration of Independence and what it means. And so we're hoping that this is something that can get a lot of traction across the country, and people who can't come here can really engage and have these conversations with their friends, colleagues, and people who disagree with them as well.
You want to say a word about MTI too?
Yeah, so to this point about how we're getting out from Monticello, we have and have had for quite a while now what we call the Monticello Teachers Institute, which is a program that invites cohorts of teachers, typically twice each summer, to come to Monticello and experience an immersive week over the course of the summer. They're paid for the work. They get oftentimes credit for the work, but they come here for a week. They engage deeply with the site, just as you have today. They meet with the experts at the International Center for Jefferson Studies. But most importantly, and the feedback we get from our teachers, is that what they most appreciate is time to talk with each other about how they teach this content in their classrooms and develop strategies and share strategies. And this has created for us a network of teachers across the country. In fact, our Melanie Holland, who leads that program, she's actually in California as we speak, presenting at the California Social Studies Teachers Conference with an alum from MTI about this program. We are also looking into how do we build that out into online professional development opportunities for teachers so that we are engaging with the people who are training tomorrow's generation on these topics as well.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about the train the trainers model. There's a proposal that I'm shopping now, both to philanthropies in democracy and education, to foundations in democracy and education, individual philanthropists, to start doing summits here where we train museum and library educators in some of the techniques that Steve and Brandon are talking about. And with this, there's a group of about 310 community learning partner organizations across the country in order to respond to some of the questions I was getting about this proposal. I put out a question to the network about how many people they serve so that we can make a case that, what do you get for each trainer you train? And it averages out to 18,000 people. Right, so you bring in 300 people in the summer to do immersive technique workshops, and whether you're serving 5,000 people in Boone Lake, Kentucky, at a local historical society, or $4 million a year at the National Museum of American History, these are, as Steve said at the beginning, highly trusted institutions that, as we were all asked to do in math class, show their work. So I do think that train the trainer model is important to Kat. And I could talk forever, but I should hear from Maggie, and then we should go and clink glasses.
Monticello did something in the 1970s that changed the course of landscape history and landscape preservation in the United States. That is, they decided that this was a museum that was already dedicated to telling the truth. This is a trustworthy institution, as it still is. And so they decided that the unspoken landscape, the unspoken curriculum of the landscape and the choices that Jefferson had made was just as important as gathering the belongings that had been Jefferson's, as telling the story of the way that the building was built and everything that was in it, and those kinds of choices, the people who worked the land, that it was very important to also reflect, because the archive includes such detailed accounts of every plant that was planted, which plants got along well with each other, where all the specimens that Lewis and Clark were bringing back, where they came from, what grew with them, how all of that fit together into this unwritten curriculum of democratizing, of civic virtue, of gentlemanly disinterestedness that Jefferson wanted Monticello to represent, right? So there is a reason why, as a Francophile, he's not building this with French architecture, right? It's neoclassical, which has its roots in Villa Rotonda in Italy, and then Chiswick in England, and then it comes here, right? It doesn't look like Versailles. The gardens look nothing like Versailles, and nothing like most French gardens of the 18th century. Instead, they look like the British park-like gardens that Capability Brown and other landscape designers like him were creating. So it became, in the 1970s, very important for Monticello to turn their eye toward that kind of, as you're experiencing this place, what are you also learning about Jefferson and civic friendship? His friendships also extending to people who were collecting plants and discussing botany. He wanted his daughters to be well educated in botany, and some of the record includes all the letters that he was writing to his daughters about this. So my father, Rudy J. Favretti, was essentially self-taught. He spent so much time in public libraries as a child that they created a little corner for him. And one of the things that he loved most was reading about Thomas Jefferson. And not because he had this kind of, wide-eyed awe of a hero, but because he was fascinated by the complexity and the difficulties and the way that people made choices in difficult times. And he was fascinated by the intersection of all of Jefferson's interests into a civic language. And this was something that my father also tried to teach me, dragging me around to listen, to take eggs to the old people and listen to all of their stories, turned me into a cultural historian, but also into a story listener and a community builder. And this idea of civic virtue is something my father took very seriously, and hung a reproduction of a portrait of Jefferson at the foot of our stairs and said, every time you come down the stairs, you need to think about the importance of civic values, of ethics. And then in the late 70s, by the time I went to college, he said, you need to give him a nod because he's paying for your college degree. And so additionally, just one quick story, the way that, just as all of you are doing this as a passion, right? This is more than just a job, and you can hear that in everything you say. This is also a family and a reconnection of families divided. And for my father was a night owl. And we used to have to tiptoe around the house in the morning for fear of waking up my father. But we knew that he loved being here and coming here because he would have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go catch a flight to get here, and he never, ever once complained about it. Thank you.